how nuclear war begins. It ends in 72 minutes, and 5 billion people would be dead.
Do you think there will be a nuclear war?
So I've interviewed former secretaries of defense, the former nuclear sub-commander, the Secret Service. And what I learned was, oh my God.
Annie Jacobsen, investigative researcher and writer who specializes in uncovering the world's biggest secrets.
We are one misunderstanding away from nuclear apocalypse. And yet you have presidents threatening nuclear war. In fact, the President of the United States doesn't need to ask anyone to launch a nuclear missile.
It makes me realize how important the decision to pick our leaders is.
Nothing could be more important.
Could you play out a scenario where nuclear war broke out?
Yes, and I can describe in painstaking, horrific detail precisely what happens. But after nuclear war, the survivors would be forced to live underground and envy the dead.
Annie, is there anyone you interviewed that brought you to tears?
Yes, I met a woman who is a survivor of the Nagasaki bomb. And I haven't written about this yet. But someone I interviewed and someone that meant a lot to me wired that nuclear weapon that was dropped on Nagasaki.
Can you speak about the impact that it had on both those individuals?
And it's horrifying.
One of the things that it did make me think when I realized that there's one individual in the United States where we are now who can make that decision, and that there's basically like someone following the president with a briefcase called it's like the football or something.
Yes.
What is that football for people that don't know?
Yeah, and so now that people know about the football, or when they read it, you can see in photographs of the president, you will almost, if he's in frame, you'll see the mil aide. That's the military aide, an individual who is assigned to be with the president 24/7, 365. And inside the football, it's called the emergency satchel, are two important things. There's instrumentation that allows the president to be identified as the president to the National Military Command Center, which is the nuclear bunker beneath the Pentagon. Okay, so it's a call and response authentication. And then there is something called, colloquially, the Black Book. And it was told to me the reason it's called the Black Book is because it involves so much death. And what the Black Book is a list of nuclear strike options for the president to choose from. And so once the president is notified that a ballistic missile is coming at the United States, and he has to make a decision about a counterattack, he must look quickly because, as you learn in the book, and as I learned from presidents, there is a 6-minute window of decision-making. And so there's no time for a roundtable discussion. There is a list of options that has been pre-prepared for the president to choose from. And I interviewed for the book someone who actually was responsible for some of those decisions in the 80s. And he described to me in appalling detail what it was like to have worked on this in the Pentagon, like worked out numerically different targets and why they would be targets in said strike X, Y, Z, or Q against said nation. And then later seeing the Black Book and realizing the like sort of transmutation of that information to what was described by the only mil aide who's ever gone on the record speaking about this as essentially like a Denny's menu list of options. And so you understand that this list is so watered down into strike options, and there is so little time that the president, in essence, has really no idea what he's striking and how many millions of people will be killed.
When I hear that, it makes me realize how important the decision to pick our leaders is. Something I didn't realize before.
Nothing could be more important. And yet I learned in the book, and I'm talking about from former secretaries of defense, people very close to the president, that most presidents are ill-informed about their role as commander-in-chief in a nuclear war. And it was said to me, most don't want to know. And again, so this brings us back to that paradox of deterrence, the original question I asked in writing and reporting this book. What if deterrence fails? Deterrence is this idea. We will have so many nuclear weapons pointed at the other side. They will have so many nuclear weapons pointed at us. No one would be insane enough to let any of them loose. That's how we all stay safe. Another way of saying deterrence is more nuclear weapons make us more safe. You can decide if you think that's a little Orwellian, but that is what exists.
Okay, so with that in mind, we should really be doing mental checks on our leaders every 3 months, because we've all probably had an experience with someone who's had a episode, and I'll leave it at episode because there's a variety of different types of episodes one can have. And I was thinking, well, if the president just has a bit of an episode and gets a little bit paranoid or, sort of has a little bit of a schizophrenic paranoia, which can happen to people for a variety of different unpredictable reasons, then that president could potentially make a decision to end the planet. And there doesn't seem to be a defense mechanism to stop him doing that or her doing that.
You're reminding me of a famous story when Nixon was president, and it was during the Watergate scandal. He probably knew the end of his presidency was near. And he was very drunk one night, and he began to threaten, or rather he just began to talk, in this sort of extremely verbose, drunken manner about how he could end the world or kill tens of millions of people with the push of a button. And it is said that Kissinger called up the military and said, if the president orders any kind of a nuclear strike, talk to me first.
Really? And do you think that would have happened?
I mean,
it's hard to know, isn't it?
All of these stories, unless they come out of the mouth of the individual who actually said that, are in essence stories. So there's an element of truth to them for sure. The actual command and control, who's going to follow the rules, people ask me that question often. And I took that exact question. I think people have a naivete that if you're in the nuclear command and control, whether you're a missileer in an underground silo or a submariner on a sub, that you might, when you get this command, suddenly have this heart, like in a Hollywood movie, have this moment where you say, my goodness, I'm going to save the planet rather than destroy it. I put that question to Dr. Glenn McDuff, the historian at the Classified Museum at Los Alamos, the one you and I can't go see. And I said, do you think that could happen? And he said, Annie, you have a better chance at winning Powerball than betting on someone in the nuclear chain of command and control to defy orders. And I said, why? And he said, well, you are trained to follow orders.
I spoke to a CIA agent, or should I say a former CIA agent called Andrew Bustamante. Might have seen him, he does some podcasts. And after speaking to him, I completely agree, because as he said, he was trained to, basically he was selected and trained on the basis that he would follow orders in that moment. And they even do drills to make sure, dummy drills to make sure that they're prepared, I guess psychologically, to follow through on those instructions. It made me think as well that what if the president's dead? What if the president is hit by a nuclear weapon from another country and now they can no longer make the decision? Is the decision deferred onto somebody else?
Well, I take the reader through that precisely because those are the kind of questions that I had to ask of my sources as I was reporting this. On the one hand, as I was learning what happens in the seconds and minutes, after a launch is detected, because we have a satellite system that detects the launch of a nuclear weapon in under a fraction of a second.
But it's not always very trustworthy. This is why I'm concerned.
Ours is very trustworthy, as far as I understand. It's called SBIRS. It's built by Lockheed, and it's astonishingly powerful. Other nations do not have that same kind of technology.
Because I was reading about the sort of historic mistakes that were made. Sometimes people thought there was a nuclear bomb or a strike coming, and it was actually just a bunch of swans.
Absolutely.
So I was a little bit like,
these are, this is the one miscalculation, one misunderstanding away from nuclear Armageddon.
What are those instances from history where the nuclear detection system was triggered and someone in some country decided not to follow through on a notification?
I think the most interesting stories that I report come from the person who is an actual firsthand witness to it. Because what often happens is the telephone game, whereby one person tells the story and then you add a detail. So I write about a couple of them in the book, but one of them came to me firsthand, and I'll share that with you, which was former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. And he was on the night watch during the Carter administration. He wasn't the Secretary of Defense yet. He had the job before that, the Director of Research and Engineering at the Pentagon. But it was his night watch informed the president job. And he was told by the National Military Command Center, which is the bunker beneath the Pentagon, that there were ballistic missiles on the way from Soviet Russia. This was confirmed by the nuclear bunker beneath Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, the Stratcom bunker. And not only were they intercontinental ballistic missiles flying at the United States, but they were sub-launched ballistic missiles coming at the United States. And it was a massive mother lode of warheads. And Perry described to me, as I recount in the book, what that was like to try and process in your mind, oh my God, I'm going to have to tell the president and he is going to have to make a counterattack. And within a matter of minutes, he got word that it was a mistake. And a mistake, you might ask, a mistake? How does a mistake happen? What he told me was that it was a VHS tape, a simulated war game, a simulated attack by the Soviet Union against the United States. And the VHS tape had mistakenly been inserted into a machine in the nuclear bunker beneath the Pentagon. And because it is linked to Stratcom, it was seen in both places. And Perry said to me, it looked real because it was meant to look real.
Mm-hmm. There was a president you talk about that played a nuclear war game and discovered that there could be no winners.
So Proud Prophet game
yeah,
is one of the few, a very rare declassified nuclear war game. People talk about, jealously guarded secrets in the United States government. You can be sure that anything having to do with nuclear wargaming is way up there in the top secrets, along with what is actually in that black book. But the Proud Prophet war game was declassified. Reagan had ordered it. I don't believe he participated in it. His SecDes, everybody in the Nuclear Command and Control participated in it for 2 weeks in 1983. And this is declassified. I reprint some of it in the book. And if you have a look at it, you might say to yourself, well, what's the point of declassifying something that looks like this? It's just black. It's like there's a number here and a word there and a page number, but mostly it's entirely redacted. And so what's the point of declassifying it? Well, for the public, something very valuable came out of that, which is it allowed a certain civilian who was participating, a Yale professor named Paul Bracken, to actually speak about it in a general way. He couldn't tell OPSEC, but he could generally talk about it. And what he said in his own book was that no matter how nuclear war begins, NATO's involved, NATO's not involved, China's involved, no matter how it begins, it ends in nuclear Armageddon. And Bracken's words was that everyone left really depressed.
Nuclear Armageddon essentially means the world is destroyed.
Nuclear Armageddon is the world is destroyed. And when you get to the end of the book, which happens in 72 minutes, and that comes from something that former Stratcom director General Keeler said to me when we were discussing and interviewing, and I asked him about what could happen if there was a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States, and he said the world could end in the next couple of hours.
So from where we are now in this conversation to the end of this conversation, if a nuclear war broke out and we were sat here, by the end of this conversation, basically the entire world would be destroyed.
And you and I wouldn't even know before the first missile hit. That was shocking to me to have that confirmed, in essence, by Obama's FEMA director. So FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is the agency in the United States that's in charge of disasters, right? So if there's a hurricane or a flood or an earthquake, FEMA steps in to help the people. They have something called population protection planning. Craig Fugate was Obama's FEMA director for 8 years, and he just covered an extraordinary amount of catastrophes in the United States. He was also responsible for planning for a nuclear war. He told me that they did that. He also said we plan for asteroid strikes. These are called low probability, high consequence events. But what Fugate told me that was shocking is that there is no population protection planning in a nuclear war because everyone will be dead. And he explained to me that there's nothing that he could do as FEMA director. He would really be putting his efforts from this nuclear bunker where he would be, which is called Mount Weather. He would be putting his efforts on the continuity of government issues, the continuity of, like, the government has what are called essential functions. So as a nuclear war is happening, the government is trying to prepare to keep the government running, which is a form of fantasy in itself. And when you read Fugate's interviews with me, he's just so candid about how there is nothing anyone can do. And, what he told me was so shocking. I went back to him and said, I just want to really make sure these are your actual quotes and he absolutely, he was one of the first people to write an Amazon review of the book after it published here in the United States. And I find that both terrifying, but also heartening for this reason, is that a lot of these people who leave office, because my sources are all former, and then the title, when they are in the command and control, they are very focused on doing their job. Hence what we spoke about earlier about following orders. They are civil servants. They are dedicated civil servants. They believe in national security. They believe in, the perseverance of government. And then they leave office and they're just regular people again. And that's when the heart, I think, begins to lead. And particularly as people get older, because I interview a lot of people in their 80s and 90s. And then they begin to think about what this means in terms of legacy. What is nuclear command and control really as buttoned up as might be them talking, as I thought? And is it a good idea in a world that is so rapidly changing, both geopolitically and also in terms of technology?
Was there one individual you met that comes to mind when I ask who the most troubled person was in terms of the work they participated in, or troubled in the context of what they know and what it means for humanity and how they're grappling with that?
The most concerned and sort of the most activated, by all means, would be former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. And he's now in his 90s, and I don't believe he's doing interviews anymore. But it's not surprising that Perry shared with me his intense worry about all of this, because he has been actively working on this and, for at least 15, 20 years. And when I say this, I mean bringing the information to the public so that the public is aware. He wrote his own book with a colleague called The Button. And he has, he did a podcast called At the Brink. And what's fascinating is Perry spent most of his life dedicated to what you might call the military-industrial complex, right? To the research and development of weapon systems that I write about in my other books, the DARPA book in particular, because this is all part and parcel to what we're talking about here, that you have this sort of industry, military weapon system industry that is in a constant state of forward movement. It's deeply tied to economics, to jobs, to prosperity. And so where does that take us? And And at what point does it end? It was Eisenhower who said in his famous speech, where the public really learned about this so-called military-industrial complex, because Eisenhower spoke of it in his farewell speech. But he also said an important thing in the second half of that speech, which doesn't get nearly as much airtime, which is that a knowledgeable and alert citizenry is how you balance sort of an idea of peace with an idea of defense. And I think what frightens both of us that we talked about in the beginning here was that peace and defense are very different than constant states of war.